Hello, these are flip notes for Unit 3.5, which is our learning unit. My Bitmoji is hidden in the books because in this section we're learning all about learning, including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning. Let's get into it.
Learning is when we have new skills and knowledge through experience, through studying, through being taught, and sometimes just through being alive, that we pick up on things from our environment. But how do you know if somebody has actually learned something? You can't just say, I know that. And you may, but you don't really aren't able to prove that you know it until you show it through your behavior. So learning has to impact behavior before it's actually considered learning. And really, maybe behavior would be a better term for this title for this chapter, because we're talking all about behaviorism and the behaviorist perspective. There are some major types of learning that we'll look at, and the two big ones are types of conditioning. And you may have heard of conditioning before in terms of strength conditioning, and that has to do with training your muscles to move in a certain way. And in this case, we mean accustoming a person or training a person or animal to behave a certain way. And there's two ways. The first is with classical conditioning, and this is where we're forming association between two things, one that's natural and one that is neutral. So we can create a new behavior. Ivan Pavlov and John B. Watson are two big people for that, and we'll go into a lot more detail with them in the next section. And then the other way that we learn very easily is through reinforcement and punishment, and those are both part of operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner is the big person who has to do with that. We've talked about John B. Watson a little bit before, probably at the beginning of the year, we were talking about the different perspectives, and this quote pops up again. He was known to be pretty arrogant because he felt that he really understood the impact of the environment on learning. He was the founder of behaviorism. He said, give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. So genetics, he said, does not play a role. He said that I can teach you to be anything. So he was on the very extreme end of the nature nurture perspective. He was on the nurture end with behaviorism. So let's talk about some other types of learning. And these we will not go as in-depth in throughout the chapter, so they'll just kind of be right here. But classical and operant and social learning, we'll talk about those more in depth. Insight learning is something that we've all done. We've had that aha moment, but we actually call it insight learning, where you solve a problem because you've suddenly reorganized information that you already had and you just understand it differently. You're using one or maybe two previously learned skills to solve a new problem. So you've been working on something, and all of a sudden, oh, I know, you have an idea. That was insight learning. Wolfgang Kohler was actually the person who studied this in depth by looking at insight learning in chimps. And he would give them different complex problems, things like how to reach some bananas that were hung up too high from their reach, or how to get a peanut out of a tall cylinder beaker. Things that they could do, but they'd have to figure it out. And they did, and they had these sudden aha moments. More recent research using neuroscience and brain scans show that when we have that aha moment of insight, that our brain actually lights up and there's a bunch of neural firing. So it's like you literally have this light bulb moment in your brain, and your brain lights up with extra neural firing. In that experiment, here's some pictures, and we'll watch some of the videos of this in class. The chimp Sultan was presented with these bananas, and these boxes were there, which he had already played around with the boxes before, but never with the bananas present. And then after a while, he was able to just stack the boxes and then reach up there. And we'll watch some of the other examples in class. Another type of learning that we all do is latent learning. And we've heard this term latent previously when we talked about latent meaning of dreams. Latent is hidden. So latent learning is unconscious or subconscious learning that we do that we don't realize it. because we're not doing it for a reward, we're not doing it for motivation. It's just something that we've picked up on in our environment. But we don't use it until later on when we need to, and we don't alter that learning until later. So, for example, knowing how to drive a little bit before you actually get behind the wheel, knowing how to do CPR just because you've seen it on so many TV shows, those would be some examples of latent learning. Edward Tolman is the person we associate with latent learning. He studied it with rats in a maze. So, what he did was he had some rats in the maze just kind of exploring it. There was no race, there was no reward, there was no punishment. He just kind of stuck them in the maze and let them run around. Later, he timed them to see how fast they could run through the maze if there was food or looks like cheese in the picture at the end of the maze. And he found that the rats who'd had time to explore the maze had much faster race times versus rats who had not had time to explore the maze. And he said what had happened was that they, even though there was no motivation to learn anything, they had formed cognitive maps and they had kind of picked up on the location and the layout of the maze, but it wasn't evident until later when there was a motivation to prove or show their behavior. So they formed cognitive maps. Here's another diagram that comes from his experiment. He would block off different routes. So the rats had to find the next best way. And again, the ones who had explored the maze earlier did better. Other examples, I already mentioned these. Another one is maybe if you've ever been riding in the car, driving or passenger, and you got stuck in traffic and you had to find an alternate route. Maybe you've never been down a road before, but you've seen it. And you think, okay, I think I could go that way instead. You've never actually had to prove that learning before, but you could, and that's latent learning. A lot of our learning comes from our social environment. Albert Bandura was the main one to study this, that we can observe behaviors and imitate them. So much of our learning comes through observation. Think about learning dance moves. The best way to do that is to watch somebody. So many girls learn to do makeup through watching YouTube tutorials. Well, Bandura said it all was part of social learning, and we'll talk about his famous Bobo doll experiment with this Bozo the clown, and that'll be in our last section of this unit. Our other big types of learning, classical and operant conditioning, are all based on forming associations between two things, and we'll dive way deep into those categories or types of learning a little bit later. Other associations, forming a taste aversion is a type of classical conditioning, something that happens very quickly. If you have a bad experience with a food and you get sick from it, then you never want to eat that again because you've formed that association with being sick. That's a type of conditioning. John Garcia studied this more in depth, and he said that we're actually biologically predisposed to form some of these aversions to things that are unsafe for us. He studied it in apes, that apes are naturally have a natural dislike for snakes because they're dangerous for them. So it's advantageous for them to have this dislike. That we naturally have a dislike for things that are really bitter because historically things that are bitter tend to be more poisonous or unsafe. So he said that there's really a biological reason for taste aversion. Some other biological constraints involving learning, that there's some things you just can't form associations with, or it's really hard to train. And that if you can train something, it'll instinctively go back to what is its natural state. So, for example, if we're training a dog not to bark, that goes against its instincts. So it can learn not to bark, like when the doorbell rings, but it really, really wants to bark. And if you don't keep rewarding or forming that association or rewarding the behavior or punishing him, he's going to instinctively drift back to his natural state. Another example would be trying to teach pigeons to fly toward a noise. If a pigeon hears a noise, it's going to fly away. But if you're trying to train it to fly toward it, you could train it, but it's going to instinctively drift back to its natural state. Usually it's a safety or defense mechanism for the animals. Forming superstitions is another type of association, usually through classical or operant conditioning, that we seem to have this random action that we associate with something extreme, whether it's good or bad, that maybe, every time you wear your smelly socks, the Dallas Cowboys win. Well, you didn't cause that to win. Remember, correlation does not equal causation. and believing that is a superstition, a type of association. And our final type of association is learned helplessness. And this comes from Martin Seligman. And we'll talk about his experiment more in depth in class. But basically, we associate our actions where we've failed to where we don't think we can succeed in the future. If you continuously fail at something, eventually you just don't want to try anymore. We'll also talk about this in the mental health section because a lot of depression comes from cycles of learned helplessness, where even if you could do better or get out of a cycle, you feel like you can't because of past failures. In the experiment, there were dogs who had been shocked and couldn't do anything about the shocks. But then later on, when they were in a situation where they were shocked, but they could get out of it, like in this case, this little beagle could just jump over this wall. The ones who had been shocked earlier with no way out didn't even try to get away from the shocks because they had learned to be helpless. We'll go in depth in that little experiment some more in class.